This morning's scripture reading is Proverbs 12, verses 24 through 28. Diligent hands will rule, but laziness ends in slave labor. An anxious heart weighs a man down, but a kind word cheers him up. A righteous man is cautious in friendship, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. The lazy man does not roast his game, but the diligent man prizes his possessions. In the way of righteousness there is life, along the path of immortality.
I want to extend my welcome to everybody here this morning. It is so good to have everybody here, especially our visitors. Whether you're here just for a Sunday or for a few Sundays, just know how valuable your presence is to us. We are almost to the end of our study on Ecclesiastes. Have one more lesson that I plan on bringing. Now next week we will have a very special guest speaker, Brother Scow from Mountain States Children's Home, but then the following week we will conclude our series of lessons. I am discovering as I get older that there are many wonderful blessings attached to growing older. To be sure, there are many, many drawbacks, and I am reminded of them every time I walk up and down my stairs. All the creaks and groans and snaps and cracks and everything else that I get to hear walking up and down the stairs. And it's not the stairs, it's me doing all of that. But there are a lot of blessings as well. One of those blessings that I have come to recognize is that many of the questions that we have when we're young are either answered or we discover that they really were not as important as we thought they were when we first asked them. Everyone, at least in this auditorium, knows that I love questions. My entire life has been driven by seeking answers to big questions and little questions and all sorts of questions in between. The very, very worst spanking that I got that I can remember was because I took one of my toys apart because I wanted to find out how it worked. My mom thought I broke it, and so I had to protest that it was my own inquisitive nature that caused me to tear it apart. Didn't work, by the way. I got the spanking anyway. But I had just always been driven by asking questions. And I think that it is that part of my personality that drives me to my love of Scripture. Because no matter how many times I read a passage, no matter how many times I study a passage, there's always just one more question, one more follow-up. I hope that as we have studied the book of Ecclesiastes, you have come up with some questions. I hope that you have asked some questions of the text. Maybe one in particular, as we have worked our way through all of the lessons that we have looked at, and that is this: how in the world can we find joy in a life that is filled with heaven? That word, that first word that we looked at many, many weeks ago, heaven. It's vanity. It's a striving after a wind. It's And the very best word that I have come to get across the message of, or the meaning of what this word means, is that it is a mist. It is a vapor. And James chapter 4 talks about the same thing. In fact, I'm almost thinking that he's quoting Ecclesiastes, or at least he's quoting the main thrust of Ecclesiastes, and that is, your life is a mist. It's here and then it's gone. Well, if that is true, how can we find joy? Get a little bit of feedback there. How can we find joy? Not happiness. Now, you may have come to the conclusion that I'm anti-happiness. I'm not. That's not what I'm trying to get across in drawing a distinction between joy and happiness. Early on, we went over the idea that happiness is always connected to something that's going on in our life. It's connected to a circumstance in our life or a person in our life. And circumstances change, and people come and go, and people sometimes hurt us very deeply, and sometimes circumstances in our life go very, very, very against us. So happiness comes and goes. It is that chasing after the wind. It is that hebel. Joy, on the other hand, is different. Joy is a decision. But how can we choose joy in a life that is so filled with vanity, despair, chasing after the wind? Well, I have in your the bulletin there in the center column a number of passages for you to go back and to review and to reread. I want to go over them very quickly this morning. See if you can pick up that answer to our question. How can we have joy? How can we choose joy in this life? Chapter 2, verses 24 to 26. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also, I saw, is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to the one who pleases God. This is a vanity and striving after wind. Chapter 3, verses 9 to 14. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful, and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it, so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. Chapter 5, first 7 verses. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay in paying, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin. Do not say before the messenger what was a mistake, that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one you must fear. And then verses 18 to 20. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil. This is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. Chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. Chapter 9 and verse 7. Go, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. And then verse 9. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil with which you toil under the sun. Chapter 11 and verse 5. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes into the bones of a womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. And then finally, chapter 12, the last verses of the book. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. I have discovered as reading through the book so many times, looking at this little facet, looking at that little facet, kind of like looking at diamonds and turning the diamond and getting the light to shine through it various directions. Kohelet keeps returning to the presence of God. He talks about the reality of God's gifts. Something I also noticed is that he keeps returning to the idea that in our finite nature, we are utterly and totally unable to understand God's infinite wisdom. Incredibly, and I want to come back to chapter 3, but incredibly, God has put the concept or the idea of eternity in our minds. And yet, we are limited. Notice how he says here, chapter 3, verse 11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. So we have the idea, we have the image, we have the concept of eternity. And yet there's such a big hole. We don't understand. No matter how wise we are, no matter how many hours, no matter how many years we spend, there's always going to be those questions. That's what I find to be so wonderful. But it's the idea that God has put the permanence of eternity in the face of all this heaven, all of this vanity, all of this chasing after the wind. As such that in and of itself is such an incredible image. If you reached out and you caught wind, what would you have in your hand? If you opened it up, it would be gone. And so we spend our entire life chasing after the wind and chasing after this hevel. And even if we caught it, what would we have? Nothing. It's vanity. Reading through the book of Ecclesiastes, what did Kohelet do in order to find happiness, only to come up empty? He spent a long, major portion of his life chasing happiness. And no matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he tried to catch it, he always came up empty. So we go back to chapter 2. And to me, chapter 2 reads like Kohelet's Facebook page. You know, if the internet existed back then, and there was such a thing called Facebook, and we could scroll through it and we could find Kohelet's Facebook page, it would read like chapter 2. I did this. I built this. I did this. I had this. I hired this. I bought this. I did. I made. And yet, what did he end up with? Happiness? No. Because everything that he built is eventually going to crumble and fall apart and come down. All of the gardens that he planted, all of those plants, all of those trees are going to die. And so as an older man now, and as I have said throughout the series, I really picture Kohelet sitting on his little tree stump or bench, park bench, whatever it was, where he sits to meditate, to think about all these things. And he's scratching his beard and thinking about it. He's looking at all the things that he built and all of the gardens that he planted and all of these things that he put together, and all of his slaves and all of his singers and all of these things that we read about in chapter 2. And he says, man, it's just been a chasing after the wind. And even if I caught something, how long did it last? But joy. You know how many times we have looked and we have read many of these texts a number of times. The word joy or enjoy or rejoice or find pleasure. All of these things keep recurring. Kohelet focused on himself for the majority of his life. He focused on the temporary and the passing hebel, the vanity, the momentary pleasures that vanish as fast as they appear. And so this morning, today, 2024, we can ask yet another question. What sucks the joy from our lives? And the first answer to that is a whole bunch of things. A lot of things seem to suck the joy out of our life. But perhaps chief among them is what Kohelet found out in chapter 2. And that is we focus on ourselves. I'm guilty of it. And I'm sure if we were all honest, we could say the same thing. I've mentioned this before, that I see two huge inventions in our life, not our lifetime, but in our life, that have worked to bring misery into this world. The first one, millennia ago, was the mirror. You stop to think about it. If we didn't have a mirror, if we couldn't look at our own face, just think of all the issues and all the problems that would disappear. We would have somebody else maybe do our hair for us. Now, gentlemen, it might be a little bit dangerous to shave, but we wouldn't have to get all that close. A pair of scissors would probably do good enough. But we invented the mirror, and guess what happened? I'm not as good looking this morning as I was yesterday, or at least I thought I was. And so I have to make myself pretty. And so we spend hours upon hours upon hours staring at our reflection. The other one, far, 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 far more recent, is the rear-facing camera. And along with that, we invented the selfie. And so, as I have asked many, many times before, if you saved the world, if you invented the cure for cancer and didn't take a picture of it, a selfie, did it really happen? So, we focus on ourselves. I really think that if we were to categorize all the things that suck the joy out of our life, if it's not the first reason, it's got to be in the top 3. It's that we focus on ourselves. Notice how many times Kohelet uses the word I in chapter 2. I. The more we focus on ourselves, and especially what we lack, and the problems that we face, the more misery we bring upon ourselves. And yet, to the contrary, the more we focus on God, and the more we focus on God's presence, His permanent nature, the more we can find joy. I want to ask you just in passing, how have generations upon generations upon generations of slaves and other oppressed peoples managed to find such joy in life? They had nothing. They owned nothing. They were oppressed. They were brutally beaten. And yet, you go back and you can always find stories and accounts of incredible joy from these people. The more we focus on God, God's gifts, and God's permanent nature, then we can find joy. We can choose joy. And by extension, the more we focus on the gifts of God. Do you notice all the passages that we read? And you can go back and you can reread these texts, reread these passages once again. How many times Kohelet speaks of the gifts that God gives to us? the things that we receive from God, our blessings from God. This, he says, is a gift from God. Your toil is a gift from God. And so as we focus on what God has blessed us with, has given us, we can realize we can choose joy. Now, that might bring incredible happiness. And I don't want to come across as some kind of, I was thinking this past week, and for whatever reason, an image came across my mind to try to get across the two different kinds of Christians, or two different kinds of people sometimes that we Christians are. There are Eeyore kind of Christians. You know who Eeyore is, don't you? Little donkey that's always moping along. And hi Eeyore, how's life? Oh, I guess it's okay. I don't want anybody to think I'm an Eeyore kind of Christian. Now, I'm probably not going to fool anybody to thinking that I'm a Tigger kind of Christian either. You know, Tigger's bounce, boing, 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 and Tigger's always happy, and Tigger's always doing it. Tigger, he's just always ecstatic. Tigger has experienced joy in his life. And that is what allows him to be happy. So if we find the joy that God has given to us, I pray that we also find happiness. I am not opposed to happiness. What I am opposed to is placing happiness as some sort of goal to reach, because even if you grabbed it momentarily, what would you have? On the other hand, by seeking joy, then happiness can be a derivative of the joy that we choose. I want to make just a brief digression. I want to come back to chapter 5 here. And young people, this is probably for you more than those of us who have made a few more laps around the sun. One college devotional, every day we would have chapel, and we would hear a message from typically a professor, but from time to time there would be a student. I can't remember the name of the individual who brought this particular message, but I'll always remember the message. Apparently, he had enough. His happiness quotient had been completely filled with speakers who would get up to bring a message during chapel, and they would say something along the lines of, when you get out into the real world, and this would be kind of a recurring theme. It wouldn't just be one speaker, it would be a number of speakers. Well, you know, you're here at university for 4 years, 6 years, whatever, but when you get out into the real world. And he said, enough. Enough. He said, young people, this is the real world. And he wasn't talking about ACU. He wasn't talking about a university education. He wasn't talking about any kind of higher education. What he was talking about was what we were doing at that moment. And that was worshiping. He said everything else is false. The only real world is when we are in the presence of God and we are living in God's realm, in God's kingdom. That is the real world. And so when you get out into the real world, make sure you stay in worship to God. It's fascinating that chapter 5 holds the central part of Kohelet's message. And I want to read once again the first 3 verses in particular. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Be careful, young folks and old folks. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. What was it? Where was it that Kohelet finally found joy? It wasn't in the circumstances of his life. Circumstances come, circumstances go. People come, people go. Where he found joy, where he made the decision to be joyful and to rejoice, was in the gifts of God. The greatest of these gifts is God's presence, God's permanence. And there's one word. So we've got one more word to add to our long list of words that we've looked at in Ecclesiastes. The last word is eternity. The permanence of the presence of God. So, our choice. Do we choose hebel? Do we choose vanity? Do we choose chasing after the wind? Or do we choose eternity? What is our choice? Maybe this morning there is somebody who wants to choose eternity. They've had enough chasing after the wind. They've had enough emptiness. They've had enough vanity. They realize that there's only one permanent thing, and that is God. Maybe that you have made that decision, that you have declared your allegiance to the Son of God, but you find yourself falling away from him as you strive after emptiness and vanity, and you want to come home. You want to make your life right with God. Maybe that there's a special need on your heart, special prayer request that we can share with you, that we can lift up before God our Father. If there is any need that you have, that we can take care of you as your spiritual family, would you let us know as we stand and sing?